A disbarred attorney accused of murder is on the run, and people who know him say they're terrified that he will come after them.
He once defended the law in a courtroom, but on a summer morning in Georgia, the law came knocking on his own front door. Inside, they found a body, and a story that shocked even seasoned detectives. What begins as a white-collar crime investigation spirals into a grim murder inquiry. The man who once wrote checks on behalf of his clients may have signed the warrant for the murder of his own flesh and blood. Richard Merritt once lived a life admired by many, a family man, a father, and an attorney with his own practice. On the surface, everything seemed picture perfect, but behind closed doors, a web of deception was slowly unraveling. For part of his childhood, Richard Merritt lived in luxury in Saudi Arabia with his parents, Shirley and Robert Sr. His father was a defense contractor back then. According to Robert, his brother's manipulative behavior started early, and it worsened over the years. In 9th grade, Richard moved to Atlanta to live with Robert so he could continue his education. Robert says that he was stuck at that time, acting as his brother's cook, driver, and house servant. In the early 1990s, Robert Sr. and Shirley also moved back to Georgia, and Robert Sr. retired later. Richard, who went on to study law, married his college sweetheart, and initially struggled to get his career off the ground. According to his brother, he was lazy and failed the exam several times. His wife also had an interesting way of explaining his career.
He became an attorney quite some time after he graduated. It took him 3 times to pass the bar. Okay. He worked for many firms. He practiced many different kinds of law. Over the years, he had a lot of different jobs at a lot of different firms doing different things. He had his own private practice prior to losing his license.
In November of 2000, Robert Sr. died suddenly while traveling with his wife Shirley. The grieving widow dedicated herself to spending time with her grandchildren and rebuilding her life. Meanwhile, Richard worked for the Georgia Attorney General's office and then for several law firms. In 2003, Richard moved his growing family to Smyrna, Georgia. There, Richard and his wife raised their son and daughter, and 7 years later, he opened his own law practice. With his success, Richard seems to have created the ideal life, but in May of 2017, that veneer of perfection was shattered when he received a court summons after returning from a family vacation. Merritt had settled a lawsuit for 2 sisters who were clients, but without their knowledge, he had pocketed their $70,000 settlement check. Investigators found that over the course of several years, Merritt stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from clients, many of them elderly, pocketing funds from settlements meant to help them recover. Merritt appeared to live high on the hog, while 2 of his victims begged for a police investigation. He drove a Porsche and posted trips on his Facebook page that included deep-sea fishing, Braves baseball, and beach resort getaways. Cobb County Police finally investigated and arrested Merritt on theft, forgery, and elderly abuse charges. He pleaded guilty and faced the wrath of 13 victims. Each one came to court to tell Merritt and the judge what he had done to their lives. One by one, they told their stories to the court, stories of betrayal, pain, health problems, money problems, and lack of faith in a slow-moving criminal justice system that let Merritt run wild on everyone else's dime.
There are so many judgments against him. There's no way he's going to repay all the money. So that the only thing that's going to make us feel better is if he's sitting in jail.
Not only did Richard lose his license to practice law and his livelihood, his wife also filed for divorce and fought for custody of their children. In 2019, a Cobb County judge sentenced Merritt to 15 years in prison and ordered him to pay his victims $454,706 in restitution after he pleaded guilty to 34 felony counts, including theft, forgery, exploitation of an elderly person, and bank account fraud. The judge described Merritt as despicable, deplorable, and reprehensible. But Merritt didn't go to prison right away. He was granted one final weekend with his mother before turning himself in.
Richard Merritt is dealing with some family medical issues, and the prosecution agreed to let him turn himself in to begin his 15-year prison sentence on February 1st.
Shirley Merritt had stood by her son through every accusation. To her, he was still the boy she raised, not the criminal the court described. Shirley Merritt was 77 years old, and she was the only person left in Richard's life who had not washed their hands of him. She was always there to lift him out of his financial woes. By the time his trial was done, she was practically bankrupt, taking out a second mortgage on her home to bail him out of jail. However, according to her other son, Richard continued to treat his mother horribly through it all. On February 1st, 2019, she welcomed him home, cooking his favorite meal. It was meant to be a goodbye, a gesture of love and forgiveness before they had to make that trip to turn her son over to the Cobb County Jail. But what happened that night was anything but loving. The next morning, Richard Merritt was gone, and so was Shirley, until law enforcement found her body at the bottom of the basement stairs. His mother was stabbed with such force that the blade of the knife broke off in her skull. Investigators also discovered a broken knife handle near Shirley's body and 2 missing steak knives from the kitchen. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the victim knew her attacker. With Richard and his mother's car missing, he immediately became suspect number 1. A nationwide manhunt for Merritt ensued.
This is the arraignment calendar for Division 1.
Another routine day at the DeKalb County Courthouse. Defendants file into court. But on this day, one high-profile defendant is a no-show.
State v. Richard Merritt.
Richard Merritt, disgraced lawyer, convicted thief, now facing a murder charge.
No response.
U.S. Marshals issued a federal warrant for his arrest, warning the public that he was armed and dangerous. The remainder of his family stayed on edge, wondering if they too would be his victim.
I'm afraid that he's out of the country, since he just vanished without a trace. I initially thought that this was spontaneous, but I do think now that he's done such a good job of escaping and hiding that this must have been planned.
The fugitive had ditched his court-ordered ankle monitor at nearby truck stop, stolen his mother's Lexus, and disappeared. The Marshals' manhunt found surveillance video of Merritt stopping at a convenience store before leaving town headed north. They tracked his movements across several states, but for 8 months, Merritt remained on the run. Merritt had landed near Nashville, Tennessee. He changed his appearance, shaved his head and beard, discarded his cell phone, and even tried to blend in, but time was against him. The hunt intensified, and pressure mounted. People across the country were warned. This man was not just a thief, but now considered armed and dangerous. Tips began to pour in. A man matching Merritt's description was seen in Tennessee, then Alabama. But it was in Nashville where his luck finally ran out. Although Merritt had changed car tags, he was still driving the SUV registered in his mother's name. He obtained a fake ID and had been going by the name of Mick Malvo and working at an Irish pub. He then starts setting up online dating profiles. Some poor woman actually found his profile attractive and began speaking with him. Not long after dating, she allowed him to move in with her. He told the woman that he was in marketing, he had no kids with his ex-wife, and both of his parents were no longer alive due to natural causes.
Marietta attorney who's been on the run since February has finally been caught.
On September 30th, 2019, U.S. Marshals catch up with Richard Merritt. The first flag came when the attorney representing him in his criminal case received a strange cartoon in the mail. It was the same cartoon flyer that Merritt claimed were mailed to he and his mother by those he had defrauded. It was postmarked from Nashville, Tennessee. But the stolen Lexus was the catalyst to Richard Merritt's capture. Someone had broken into the vehicle, and a patrolling officer ran the tag. He found it was stolen, ran the VIN number, and saw there was a bolo on the Lexus. From there, marshals began surveilling him and eventually took him into custody without incident at a nearby thrift store. Back in Georgia, Merritt now faced more than just financial crimes. He was charged with the murder of his own mother, the one person who never stopped believing in his innocence. In court, prosecutors laid out the horrific details: blunt force trauma, defensive wounds. The scene was described as personal, rage-filled, a betrayal carried out in the heart of a mother's home. Richard, being the classic narcissist he was, insisted on testifying in his defense. That didn't go too well for him.
In 2018, I was arrested in Cobb County for multiple counts of theft, forgery, and there were some counts also of elder exploitation because I did steal money from some elderly folks. Several months earlier, I had voluntarily surrendered my bar license since I started my practice in 2010, but it was right on the little village square. That was part of why I picked that area, because I saw a need. I wanted to be the local lawyer that people went to first for help. And it was a very successful, actually the first time I got arrested in connection with the Cobb County fraud was in April of 2017. It was shortly after spring break that year. We had just gotten back, and I had, in January of 2018, they had taken out a warrant for one account of theft by conversion, alleging I'd stolen $70,000. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to appear at the funds were extremely tight and limited. I was in the Cobb County Jail. Janine was scrambling to try to make sense of what was going on and take care of the children. So my mother graciously offered to assist with his initial fee payment.
And Mr. Queen, this is turning into a lot of narrative. So you need to either ask some specific questions or instruct your client to confine his answers to the questions that are asked.
While on the stand, Merritt claimed 2 random men knocked on his mother's front door that day. When he answered it, they pulled out a gun and forced their way into the home.
They said, head to the basement and don't say an effing word. She opened the door to the basement, flicked on the light. It was a two-step process to get down those stairs. You had 4 or 5 steps that went down, there's a landing, and then you make the turn, and there's the longer flight of stairs. They proceeded first. My mother was crying. She was making sounds like she might be wanting to scream or shout. He told her to shut the F up and pushed her down the stairs. It was the worst sound I've ever heard in my life. She plunged headlong into the wall. It's a sound I can hear to this day as I'm sitting here. And I could tell that there was a dent or a hole in the wall. She was trying to get up and move around, but from my vantage point, she appeared like she couldn't get her balance. The gentleman who pushed her down the stairs put his pistol behind his back into the back part of his jeans. He ran down the stairs, turned the corner, and came back with the 35-pound weight that has been seen during the course of this trial.
And where did the knife come from?
Well, the knife came later. This monster took this dumbbell and proceeded to bludgeon my mother right in front of me. And she stopped moving at this point. And then the older guy took off up the stairs. He came back a few minutes later with the kitchen knife and proceeded to stab my mother repeatedly in front of me. I cannot believe what I was seeing. I didn't understand what would be the purpose because she wasn't moving. Why is any of this happening? It was a complete and utter nightmare. There's nothing I could do. I had a pistol to my back. I couldn't believe this was happening. I had no clue who these people were or why they were doing this to us. So he stabbed her with such force that the handle broke off the knife. I didn't realize at the time that the knife was still stuck in my poor mother's face. He put the handle down on the tile across from the dumbbell. He then turned and looked at me, and he pulled out his cell phone. And he proceeded to show me a picture of my ex-wife dropping Mia off at her school, a picture of Jack being dropped off or picked up at Lovett, a picture of them all getting out of her van at their rental home in Marietta, and a picture of her either coming or going from her clinic in Vinings. And he said, and I'll never forget this as long as I live, if you say a single word, they're next. And then they left. No, I did not call the police. These guys had left. I went and got a small backpack out of my room. I put a few clothes. I didn't pack much. Some basic toiletries. And I left. I took my mother's car because it had more gas in it than my car. It had a bigger tank. And I had no idea where I was going or where I was going to end up.
There were no tears from Richard, no visible remorse. The jury took only 90 minutes to return with a verdict.
As of count 1, malice murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. As of count 2, felony murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. As of count 3, felony murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. As of count 4, aggravated assault, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. As of count 5, aggravated assault, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. As of count 6, possession of knife during commission of a felony, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. This 24th day of May, 2023.
Shirley Merritt was an absolutely wonderful person. She was a joy to be around. She was a very giving and loving person. And a great person was murdered by her own son. All this started almost 5 or 6 years ago now, when Richard was first arrested for stealing from clients, mostly elderly clients. And he showed then he had no compunction about doing anything. When it came time for him to go to prison, he couldn't stand the idea of somebody with an ego as big as his being sent to prison. His whole life has been a pretext. And I just want the court to know what an evil person he is in the eyes of his family.
Mr. Merritt, as to count 1, malice murder, I do sentence you to life without the possibility of parole. Counts 2 and 3 will be vacated as a matter of law. Counts 4 and 5 will merge with count 1. As to count 6, possession of a knife during the commission of a felony, I do sentence you to 5 years to serve consecutive to the sentence in count 1, for a total sentence of life without parole plus 5 years.
Richard Merritt, now 49 years old, will never see the outside of prison walls. Robert says he has absolutely no pity for his younger sibling. He said, "I think he deserves to be where he is. He can sit there and think about what he did." He added, "The absolute lack of respect and clear contempt he has shown for his family, his mother, and his father's memory is unforgivable." In November of 2024, Merritt told a DeKalb County judge that his trial attorney failed him and he should get a second chance to prove he didn't kill his own mother back in 2019. In his motion for a new trial, Merritt also argued the jury's verdict contradicted the evidence, among other points. He said his public defender, Daryl Queen, shouldn't have allowed his ex-wife to tell a story on the stand about a physical altercation between the two of them. In this story that his ex-wife told, she said we were in an argument, we were in the bedroom, he pushed me to the ground, and I hit my head on the bed. Merritt's current attorney, Shante Hightower, asked Queen why he didn't object when Mrs. Merritt made those statements on the stand. Queen's response was, "Asking the judge to bail me out when I ask a question is not something I commonly do." All in all, the ex-Mrs. Merritt's full testimony at his trial was powerful.
I served him divorce papers 5 days after he was arrested. And I divorced my ex-husband when I found out about his double life and his crimes and what he had done to all those people and what he had done to us. He didn't pay our mortgage for 6 months, so we lost our home. At the time of his arrest, January of 2018, we lost our electricity because he hadn't paid the bill. I had a van that I used to transport my daughter and her wheelchair, and he pawned the van.
Merritt also argued that Queen should have had his son Jack testify about his father's good character and the threats the family was receiving, and that he should have put his former attorney in the Cobb County case on the stand as well.
There's concern that we're being followed or the house is being watched.
Additionally, Merritt's appeal argued Queen should have put Wellingham, the defense attorney from his financial crimes, on the stand to discuss threats his mother had received. So, the judge summoned Wellingham to the appeals hearing.
In fact, I do suspect that they were authored by Mr. Merritt. What made more sense was that someone who was a narcissistic sociopath that was calculating enough to steal from all these people, his own clients, and then to murder his own mother, it made more sense that he would be planting little seeds that would grow into a defense later.
His testimony did not help Merritt. In fact, in her ruling, the judge said that Mr. Wellingham's testimony would have been harmful to the defendant. Judge Courtney Johnson denied Richard Merritt a new trial. In her order, written on January 6th of 2025, she called the jury's verdict in the case sound. Judge Courtney Johnson's decision isn't surprising and means Merritt must take his case to the Georgia Supreme Court if he wants to appeal. However, even if Merritt were to be acquitted of his mother's murder, he still faces a 30-year sentence in Cobb County, Georgia from his theft, forgery, and the elderly abuse conviction there. Shirley Merritt's love for her son never wavered, not even in her final moments. But love, tragically, was not enough to save her, and the man she once cradled in her arms will now die behind bars.